Orunoko, or The Royal Slave is a work of prose fiction by Aphra Behn, 1640–1689, published in 1688 by William Canning and reissued with two other fictions later that year. It was also adapted into a play. The eponymous hero is an African prince from Coromantine who is tricked into slavery and sold to European colonists in Suriname, where he meets the narrator. Behn's text is a first-person account of Orunoko's life, love, rebellion, and execution. Orunoko, or The Royal Slave, centers on the unlucky love story of Oroonoko, an African prince, and the beautiful Amoinda. Aphra Behn, Bapt. The 14th of December 1640, to the 16th of April 1689, was an English playwright, poet, prose writer and translator from the Restoration era. As one of the first English women to earn her living by her writing, she broke cultural barriers and served as a literary role model for later generations of women authors. Rising from obscurity, she came to the notice of Charles II, who employed her as a spy in Antwerp. Upon her return to London and a probable brief stay in debtor's prison, she began writing for the stage. She belonged to a coterie of poets and famous libertines such as John Wilmot, Lord Rochester. Behn wrote under the pastoral pseudonym Astrea. During the turbulent political times of the exclusion crisis, she wrote an epilogue and prologue that brought her into legal trouble. She thereafter devoted most of her writing to prose genres and translations. A staunch supporter of the Stuart line, she declined an invitation from Bishop Burnet to write a welcoming poem to the new King William III. She died shortly after. Behn, often cited as the first known professional female writer, was a successful playwright, poet, translator and essayist. She began writing prose fiction in the 1680s, probably in response to the consolidation of theaters that led to a reduced need for new plays. Published less than a year before she died, Orunoko is sometimes described as one of the first novels in English. Interest in Orunoko has increased since the 1970s, with critics arguing that Behn is the foremother of British female writers, and that Orunoko is a crucial text in the history of the novel. The novel's success was jump-started by a popular 1695 theatrical adaptation by Thomas Southern which ran regularly on the British stage throughout the first half of the 18th century, and in America later in the century. Summary. Orunoko, or The Royal Slave is a relatively short novel set in a narrative frame. The narrator opens with an account of the colony of Suriname and its inhabitants. Within this is a historical tale concerning the Coromantine grandson of an African king, Prince Oroonoko. At a very young age Prince Oroonoko was trained for battle, becoming an expert captain by the age of 17. During a battle the best general sacrifices himself for the prince by taking an arrow for him. In sight of this event, the prince takes the place of general. Oroonoko decides to honorably visit the daughter of the deceased general to offer the trophies of her father's victories, but he immediately falls in love with Amoinda and later asks for her hand in marriage. The king hears Amoinda described as the most beautiful and charming in the land, and he also falls in love. Despite his intelligence saying she had been claimed by Orunoko, the king gives Amoinda the royal veil, thus forcing her to become one of his wives, even though she is already promised to Orunoko. Amoinda unwillingly, but dutifully, enters the king's harem, the Oden, and Orunoko is comforted by his assumption that the king is too old to ravish her. Over time the prince plans a tryst with the help of the sympathetic Onahal, one of the king's wives, and Behn, a friend to the prince. The prince and Amoinda are reunited for a short time and consummate their marriage, but they are eventually discovered. Amoinda and Onahal are punished for their actions by being sold as slaves. The king's guilt, however, leads him to lie to Orunoko that Amoinda has instead been executed, since death was thought to be better than slavery. The prince grieves. Later, after winning another tribal war, Orunoko and his men visit a European slave trader on his ship and are tricked and shackled after drinking. The slave trader plans to sell the prince and his men as slaves and carries them to Suriname in the West Indies. Orunoko is purchased by a Cornish man named Treffry, but given special treatment due to his education and ability to speak French and English which he learned from his own French mentor. Treffry mentions that he came to own a most beautiful enslaved woman and had to stop himself from raping her. Unbeknownst to Orunoko, Treffry is speaking of Amoinda who is at the same plantation. The two lovers are reunited under the slave names of Caesar and Clement. The narrator and Treffry continue to treat the hero as an honored guest. The narrator recounts various entertaining episodes, including reading, hunting, visiting native villages, and capturing an electric eel. Orunoko and Amoinda live as husband and wife in their own slave cottage, and once she becomes pregnant, Orunoko petitions for their return to the homeland. After being put off with vague promises of the governor's arrival, Orunoko organizes a slave revolt. The slaves, including Amoinda, fight valiantly, but the majority surrender when Deputy Governor Bayam promises them amnesty. After the surrender, Orunoko and Tuscan, his second-in-command, are punished and whipped by their former allies at the command of Bayam. To avenge his honor, Orunoko vows to kill Bayam. He worries, however, that to do so would make Amoinda vulnerable to reprisal after his death. The couple both decide that he should kill her, and so Amoinda dies by his hand. Orunoko hides in the woods to mourn her and grows weaker, becoming unable to complete his revenge. When he is discovered, he decides to show his fearlessness in the face of death. Orunoko cuts off a piece of his own throat, disembowels himself, and stabs the first Manwotris to approach him. Once captured, he is bound to a post. Resigned to his death, Orunoko asks for a pipe to smoke as Bannister has him quartered and dismembered. The novel is written in a mixture of first and third person, as the narrator relates events in Africa secondhand, and herself witnesses, and participates in, the actions that take place in Suriname. The narrator is a lady who has come to Suriname with her unnamed father, a man intended to be the new lieutenant general of the colony. He, however, dies on the voyage from illness. The narrator and her family are put up in the finest house in the settlement, in accord with their station, and the narrator's experiences of meeting the indigenous peoples and slaves are intermixed with the main plot of Orunoko and Amoinda. At the conclusion of the narrative, the narrator leaves Suriname for London. Structurally, there are three significant pieces to the narrative, which does not flow in a strictly biographical manner. The novel opens with a statement of veracity, wherein the narrator claims to be writing neither fiction nor pedantic history. She claims to be an eyewitness and to be writing without any embellishment or agenda, relying solely upon real events. A description of Suriname and the Southern American Indians follows. The narrator regards the indigenous peoples as innocent and living in a golden age. Next, she provides the history of Orunoko in Africa, the betrayal by his grandfather, the captivity of Amoinda, and his capture by the slaver captain. The narrative then returns to Suriname in the present. Orunoko and Amoinda are reunited, and Orunoko and Amoinda meet the narrator in Trefry. The final section describes Orunoko's rebellion and its aftermath. Orunoko is now the most studied of Aphra Behn's novels, but it was not immediately successful in her own lifetime. It sold well, but the adaptation for the stage by Thomas Southern, see below, made the story as popular as it became. Soon after her death, the novel began to be read again, and from that time onward the factual claims made by the novel's narrator, and the factuality of the whole plot of the novel, have been accepted and questioned with greater and lesser credulity. Because Mrs. Behn was not available to correct or confirm any information, early biographers assumed the first-person narrator was Aphra Behn speaking for herself and incorporated the novel's claims into their accounts of her life. It is important, however, to recognize that Orunoko is a work of fiction and that its first-person narrator, the protagonist, need be no more factual than Jonathan Swift's first-person narrator, ostensibly Gulliver, in Gulliver's Travels, Daniel Defoe's shipwrecked narrator in Robinson Crusoe, or the first-person narrator of A Tale of a Tub. There has been much debate about how Aphra Behn represents herself in Orunoko, especially in First Encounters of Europeans and Africans with Native Americans in Aphra Behn's Orunoko, White Woman, Black Prince and Noble Savages, by Violeta Trofimova. Trofimova writes, Aphra Behn and Orunoko are marginal people in their society. She acts as a powerless woman although she pretends to a considerable power in the colony, and he is a black man, an ex-prince and a slave deprived of rights and freedom. Orunoko, the protagonist of the story. Love interest of Amoinda. Orunoko is the prince of Coromantien, who is sold into slavery in Suriname by European slave traders. Orunoko later leads a slave revolt and is killed by his slave masters. Caesar, the English name that Orunoko is given after he is sold into slavery. After Orunoko's purchase, he is exclusively referred to by this name for the remainder of the text. Amoinda, the love interest of Orunoko. After Orunoko takes her virginity, the king of Coromantien sells her into slavery. Amoinda and Orunoko eventually end up on the same plantation, marry, and have children. Amoinda's pregnancy is the impetus for their slave revolt, and she is eventually killed by Orunoko. Clemen, the English name that Amoinda is given after she is sold into slavery. Amoinda is mostly referred to as Clemen after her purchase, but at the end of the text she is once again addressed as Amoinda. King of Coromantee, the elderly king and grandfather of Orunoko. He hears rumors of Amoinda and takes her as a member of his harem. After Orunoko takes Amoinda's virginity, the king sells her into slavery and lies to Orunoko, telling him that she was instead executed. Governor Bayam, the governor of Suriname and the owner of the plantation that Orunoko and Amoinda are living on. He is expected to free Orunoko and Amoinda, but never arrives. To free the slave owner that eventually purchases both Orunoko and Amoinda. Kingship. Aphra Behn herself held incredibly strong pro-monarchy views that carried over into her writing of Orunoko. The idea that Behn attempts to present within the work is that the idea of royalty and natural kingship can exist even within a society of slaves. Although Orunoko himself is a native who later becomes a slave, he possesses the traits of those typically required of a king within a typically civilized society. He is admired and respected by those who follow him, and even in death he keeps his royal dignity intact, as he would rather be executed by his owners than surrender his self-respect. Orunoko's death can be viewed as being unjustified and outrageous as the death of any king would be when caused by those who fall below him, as even though the whites are the ones who enslaved him, they are portrayed as being the ones who are the true animals. Female narrative. The unnamed female narrator of the story serves as being a strong reflection of a woman's role in society throughout the 18th century, as well as being a reflection of Behn's own personal views regarding the major themes within her work. Women within this time period were most often expected to remain silent and on the sidelines, simply observing rather than actively contributing, and the narrator in Orunoko is a portrayal of that. A female narrator is also a way to voice the real-world disagreements over women's rights, as well as slavery, to the fictional story. The narrators discussed surrounding the treatment of Orunoko, as well as her inability to watch his murder, is a way in which Behn inserts her own voice and viewpoints into the story, as her feelings towards kingship, slavery and the slave trade have been established. Likewise, the narrator's relatively inactive involvement in the story could also be viewed as a reflection of the way in which female writers of the time were viewed as well, silent and non-contributing due to their male peers, especially with Behn herself being one of very few female authors of the time. Slavery and servitude. The view of slavery and other forms of forced servitude in Orunoko is intentionally mixed. While Orunoko himself is shown as wrongly imprisoned by the whims and cruelty of his European captors, the character himself comes out in direct support of slavery multiple times through the text. Slavery is depicted as a natural order of things, the weak overcoming the strong and using these lower people as tools in order to conduct busywork such as manual labor and chores in order to free the betters of society into perusing the more important work that must be done. Orunoko goes from being a warrior and prominent figure in his society to being captured and turned to slavery at his own expense. Orunoko is seen as unjustly held in bondage as a singular entity rather than as a moral imperative for the evils of slavery in itself. 29. Gender roles. Despite